Good afternoon, Forest Hill Falcons. Mr. F here, again with Louis Sachar's Holes. Today we're going to pick up where we left off, last week actually. And last we left off, Stanley had ran into the desert or the dry lake. He ran hoping to find Zero. And we're not sure what's going to happen next, but like I mentioned last time, two boys out there on the dry lake with no water. No water at all. No food either. So how are they going to survive out there with the hot sun beating down on them? Again, chapter 33. Let's go. He slowed to a walk as far as he could tell. Nobody was chasing him. He could hear voices coming from the back of the truck, but he couldn't make out the words. Occasionally, he'd hear the revving of the engine, but the truck wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. If you remember, he kind of drove it into one of those holes they dug. Now it's stuck. He headed in what he thought was the direction of the big thumb. He couldn't see it through the haze, though. Walking helped calm him down and allowed him to think clearly. He doubted he could make it to the big thumb, and with no water in his canteen, he didn't want to risk his life on the hope that he'd find refuge there. He'd have to return to camp. He knew that, but he was in no hurry. It would be better to return later after everyone had a chance to calm down. And as long as he'd come this far, well, he might as well look for Zero. He decided he'd walk as long as he could until he was too weak to go any further. Then he'd turn around and come back. He smiled as he realized that wouldn't quite work. He would only go halfway. Well, halfway as far as he thought he could go, so that he'd still have the strength to return. Then he'd have to make a deal with the warden to tell her where he found Kate Barlow's lipstick tube and maybe beg for mercy. He was surprised by how far out the holes extended. He couldn't even see the camp compound anymore, but he still kept passing holes. Just when he thought he'd passed the last hole, he'd come across another cluster of them, a little farther away. And back at the compound, they had dug in a systematic order, row upon row, allowing space for the water truck. But out here, there was no system. It was as if every once in a while, in a fit of frustration, the warden would just pick a spot at random and say, "What the hell? Dig here." It was like trying to guess the winning numbers in the lottery. Stanley found himself looking down into each hole as he passed. He didn't admit to himself what he was looking for. More than an hour had gone by. He had thought he had surely seen the last hole. But then off to the left, he saw another cluster of them. He didn't actually see the holes. He saw the mounds of dirt that surrounded them. He stepped over the mounds and looked into the first hole. That's when his heart stopped. Down at the bottom of that hole was a family of yellow spotted lizards. Their large red eyes looked up at him. He leapt back over the man and ran. He didn't know if they were chasing after him. He thought he might have seen one of them leap out of the hole. He ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed. They hadn't come after him. He sat there a while and caught his breath. As he got back to his feet, he thought he noticed something on the ground, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like much, maybe just a big rock. But in a land of nothingness, any little thing seemed unusual. He walked slowly toward it. The encounter with the lizard had made him very cautious. It turned out to be an empty sack of sunflower seeds. He wondered if this was the same one Magna had stolen from Mr. Sir, although it did seem very unlikely. He turned it inside out and found one seed stuck to the burlap. Lunch. The sun was almost directly overhead. He figured he could walk for no more than maybe an hour, maybe two, before he had to turn back. It seemed pointless. He could see that there was nothing ahead, nothing but emptiness. He was hot, tired, hungry, well, and most of all, thirsty. Maybe he should just turn around now. Maybe he'd already gone halfway and he didn't even know it. Then, looking around, he saw a beautiful, majestic pool of water less than 100 yards away from where he was standing. He closed his eyes and opened to make sure he wasn't imagining it. The pool, it was still there. He hurried toward it, and the pool hurried away from him, moving as he moved, stopping when he stopped. There wasn't any water. It was a mirage caused by the shimmering waves of the heat rising off the dry ground. He kept walking. He still carried the empty sack of sunflower seeds. He didn't know he might find something to put in it. After a while, he thought he could make out the shape of the mountains throughout the haze. At first, he wasn't sure if there was another kind of mirage, but the farther he walked, the clearer they came into view. And almost straight ahead of him, he could see what looked like a fist, with its thumb sticking up. He didn't know how far away it was. 5 miles? 50 miles? One thing was certain, it was more than halfway. He kept walking toward it, although he didn't know why. He knew he'd have to turn around before he got there, but every time he looked at it, it seemed to encourage him, giving him the thumbs up sign. As he continued walking, he became aware of a large object on the lake. He couldn't tell what it was, or even if it was natural or man-made. It looked a little like a fallen tree, although it didn't seem likely that a tree would grow here. More likely it was a ridge of dirt or rocks. The object, whatever it was not on the way to the big thumb, but off to the right. He tried to decide whether to go toward it or the big thumb, or maybe just turn around. There was no point in heading toward the big thumb. He decided he would never make it. For all he knew, it was like chasing the moon. But he could make it to the mysterious object. He changed directions. He doubted it was anything. But the fact that there was something in the middle of all this, nothing, made it hard for him to pass up. He decided to make the object his halfway point. He had hoped he hadn't already gone too far. He laughed to himself when he saw what it was. It was a boat, or part of a boat anyway. It struck him funny to see a boat in the middle of this dry and barren wasteland, but after all, he realized that this once was a lake. The boat lay upside down, half buried in the dirt. Someone may have drowned here, he thought grimly, at the same spot where he could very well die of thirst himself. The name of the boat had been painted on the back. The upside-down red letters were peeled and faded, but Stanley could still see the name. It read, Mary Lou. Mary Lou. Where have we heard that name from? On one side of the boat, there was a pile of dirt, and then a tunnel leading down below the boat. The tunnel looked big enough for a good-sized animal to crawl through. He then heard a noise. Something stirred under the boat, and it was now coming out. "Hey!" Stanley shouted, hoping to scare it back inside. His mouth was very dry, and it was very hard to shout loudly. "Hey!" the thing answered weakly. Then a dark hand in an orange sleeve reached out of the tunnel. Chapter 35. Zero's face looked like a jack-o'-lantern that had been left out for too many days past Halloween. Half rotten, with sunken eyes and a drooping smile. Is that water?" he asked. His voice was weak and raspy. His lips were so pale they were almost white, and his tongue seemed to flop around uselessly in his mouth as he spoke, as if it kept getting in the way. "It's empty," said Stanley. He stared at Zero, not quite believing what was real. "I tried to bring you the whole water truck, but," he smiled sheepishly, "I drove it into the hole. I can't believe you're..." "Me neither," said Zero. "Come on, we've got to get you back to camp." Zero just shook his head. "I'm not going back." "You have to. We both have to." You want some sploosh?" Zero asked. "What?" Zero shaded his eyes with his forearm. "It's cooler under the boat," he said. Stanley watched Zero crawl back through the hole. It was a miracle he was still alive, but Stanley knew he would have to get him back to camp soon, even if he had to carry him. He crawled after him, and was just able to squeeze his body through the hole. He never would have fit when he first came to Camp Green Lake. He'd lost a ton of weight. As he pulled himself through, his leg struck something sharp and hard. It was a shovel. And for a second, Stanley wondered how it got there, but then remembered that Zero had taken it with him after striking Mr. Pendansky in the face. It was cooler under the boat, which was half buried in the dirt. There were enough cracks and holes in the bottom of the boat, now the roof, to provide light and ventilation. He could see empty jars scattered about. Zero held a jar in his hand and grunted as he tried to unscrew the lid. What is it?
Sploosh!
His voice was strained as he worked on the jar.
That's what I call it. They were buried under the boat here.
He still couldn't get the lid off.
Found 16 jars. Here. Hey, give me that shovel.
Stanley didn't have a lot of room to maneuver. He reached behind him, grabbed the wooden end of the shovel, and held it out to Zero, blade first.
Sometimes you just have to,
Zero said, and then he hit the jar against the blade of the shovel, breaking the top of the jar clean off. He quickly brought the jar to his mouth and licked the sploosh off the jagged edges of it before it spilled to the dirt.
Careful,
Stanley warned. Zero picked up the cracked lid and licked the sploosh off. Then he handed the broken jar to Stanley.
Here, drink some of this.
Stanley held it in his hand and stared at it for a moment. He was afraid of the broken glass. He was also afraid of the sploosh. It looked like mud. Whatever it was, he realized it must have been in the boat when the boat sank. That meant it was probably over 100 years old. Who knew what kind of bacteria might be living in it?
It's good,
said Zero, encouraging him, and he wondered if Zero had heard of bacteria. He raised the jar to his mouth and carefully took a sip. It was warm, bubbly, mushy, nectar-like. It was sweet and tangy. It felt like heaven as it flowed over his dry mouth and down his parched throat. He thought it might have been some kind of fruit at some point. Maybe peaches? Zero smiled at him.
I told you it was good.
Stanley didn't want to drink too much, but it was too good to resist. They passed the jar back and forth until it was empty. How many of those are left? Stanley asked.
None,
said Zero. Stanley's mouth dropped. Well, now I have to take you back, he said.
I'm not digging any more holes,
Zero said. They probably won't make you dig, Stanley promised. They'll probably send you to a hospital like Barf Bag.
Barf Bag stepped on a rattlesnake,
said Zero. Stanley remembered how he'd almost done the same. I guess he didn't hear the rattle.
He did it on purpose,
said Zero. You think?
He took off his shoe and socks first.
Stanley shivered as he tried to imagine it.
What's Maryalu?
Asked Zero. What? Zero concentrated hard.
Maryalu.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'll show you,
said Zero, and he crawled back out from under the boat. Stanley followed, and back outside, he had to shield his eyes from the brightness. Zero walked around the back of the boat and pointed to the upside-down letters.
Maryalu.
Stanley smiled. Mary Lou. It's the name of the boat.
Mary Lou,
Zero repeated, studying the letters.
I thought Y made the Y sound.
It does, said Stanley, but not when it's at the end of a word. Sometimes Y is a vowel, and sometimes it's a consonant. Zero suddenly groaned. He grabbed his stomach and bent over. Are you all right? Zero dropped to the ground. He lay on his side. With his knees pulled up to his chest, he continued to groan. Stanley watched helplessly. He wondered if it was a sploosh. He looked back toward Camp Green Lake. At least he thought it was the direction of Camp Green Lake. He wasn't entirely sure at this point. Zero stopped moaning, and his body slowly unbent. I'm taking you back, said Stanley.
Look,
I got a plan, so you won't get in trouble, Stanley assured him. Remember when I found the gold tube? Remember I gave it to X-Ray and the warden went crazy making us dig where she thought X-Ray had found it? I think if I tell the warden where I really found it, I think she'll let us off.
I'm not going back.
You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley.
Then I'll die out here.
Stanley didn't know what to do. He had come to rescue Zero and instead drank the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something.
I'm not.
I just want you to look at that mountain up over there. See the one over there has something sticking out of it?
Yeah, I think.
What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing. But as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed into a fist. He raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand, then back to the mountain. Right, that was 3 chapters. I hope you guys are enjoying this beautiful weather out there. It's almost summer. And with that, I'm hoping to pick up where we left off in a couple of days. Again, I miss you like crazy, all of you Forest Hill Falcons students and staff. And I'm hoping we can see each other real soon. Enjoy the rest of the day, guys. Bye.